The Sterling Innovations headquarters towered over the city, its steel and glass facade reflecting the golden hues of sunset. Inside its pristine halls, deals worth billions were made, ideas that shaped the future were born, and men in tailored suits walked with an air of untouchable superiority. And among them, pushing a mop down the long, polished corridors, was Jacob Carter. To the executives of Sterling Innovations, he was just another janitor, an invisible figure, a man whose presence was only acknowledged when a spill needed cleaning or a trash bin overflowed. And that was exactly how Jacob wanted it. Leonard Sterling was everything you expected a billionaire CEO to be: ruthless, cunning, and completely convinced of his own importance. He had built Sterling Innovations from the ground up, or so he told everyone. His name was on the building, his face was in every business magazine, and his word was law inside these walls. So when he stepped into the executive lounge that evening and found a janitor still working while he was preparing for an exclusive investors meeting, his mood soured immediately. "What the hell are you still doing here?" Leonard snapped, glaring at Jacob, who had just finished wiping down a glass table. Jacob glanced up, calm, unreadable. "Just doing my job, sir," Leonard scoffed. "Your job is to be invisible. When we have important meetings, we don't need people like you lingering around." Jacob didn't react. He simply picked up his bucket and mop, nodding once before turning toward the door. But before he could leave, Leonard smirked. "Out of curiosity, do you ever get tired of being at the bottom?" he asked, his tone laced with amusement. "Or have you just accepted that men like me will always be on top?" Jacob paused. For the first time, something flickered in his expression, a knowing look. Then, with a small, almost imperceptible smile, he said, "Oh, you'd be surprised how fast things can change." Leonard laughed, shaking his head as he turned away. To him, this janitor was nothing more than a nobody. Just another nameless worker in his empire. But what Leonard Sterling didn't know, what he never even suspected, was that this janitor was about to change his world forever. Because Jacob Carter wasn't just a janitor. He was the rightful heir to Sterling Innovations. And tomorrow? Tomorrow, Leonard Sterling would find out exactly who he had been mocking. Leonard Sterling didn't give the janitor a second thought after that night. His mind was elsewhere, on power, control, and making sure his empire remained untouchable. But the next morning, everything changed. The first sign that something was wrong came when his assistant, Claire, walked into his office with a pale face, gripping a tablet so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Sir," she said, carefully choosing her words, "there's been a development." Leonard barely looked up. "Unless it's about the investor meeting, I don't care." Claire swallowed hard. "It is. But not in the way you think." Something in her tone made Leonard finally glance at her. "Spit it out," he said. Claire hesitated, then placed the tablet in front of him. Leonard's eyes narrowed as he read the headline. "Breaking. Sterling Innovations faces hostile takeover from anonymous investor." His stomach dropped. "What the hell is this?" he growled. Claire shifted nervously. "The takeover bid came through this morning. Someone has been quietly buying up controlling shares of Sterling Innovations for months, and today they reached the threshold to demand a leadership change." Leonard's mind raced. A hostile takeover? Of his company? Impossible. There wasn't a single investor in the industry with the resources or the leverage to pull off something like this without him knowing. Unless... No, it couldn't be. "Who's behind this?" Leonard demanded, his voice dangerously low. Claire hesitated. Then, with a look of disbelief, she answered, "They haven't revealed their identity yet, but they scheduled a meeting for this afternoon." Leonard's jaw tightened. Whoever this mystery investor was, they had just made the biggest mistake of their life. Because Leonard Sterling wasn't going down without a fight. By noon, the boardroom was filled with the most powerful executives at Sterling Innovations. The tension was thick. Whispers floated around the room. No one knew who this new investor was, or how they had managed to get this much control so quickly. Leonard sat at the head of the table, his expression cold, unreadable. He was already strategizing, figuring out how to counter this takeover, crush the threat, and remind everyone who was in charge. The doors swung open, and the moment Leonard laid eyes on the man who walked in, his world stopped. Because standing at the entrance of the boardroom, dressed in a sharp black suit, was Jacob Carter, the janitor, the man he had mocked just last night. Leonard's breath caught in his throat. This had to be a joke, a mistake, a trick. But the look on Jacob's face, the quiet confidence, the calm certainty, told Leonard everything he needed to know. This was very, very real. Jacob Carter wasn't just any investor, he was the rightful heir to Sterling Innovations. And today he had come to take back what was his. Leonard Sterling sat frozen in his chair. His mind refused to process what he was seeing. Jacob Carter, the janitor, the nobody he had dismissed just last night, was the man trying to take his company. The room was dead silent as Jacob stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate, as if he was savoring this moment. Finally, Leonard forced himself to speak. "This is a joke," he said, his voice sharp. "Security, get this fraud out of here." But no one moved. Jacob let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head. "Still so sure of yourself, Leonard?" Leonard gritted his teeth. "I don't know who the hell you think you are." "Oh, I think you do," Jacob cut in smoothly. "You just don't want to admit it." He walked over to the head of the table, placing his hands on the polished wood, leaning in slightly. "But I'll remind you anyway," he continued, his voice calm, measured. "My name is Jacob Carter, and before you stole everything from him, this company belonged to my father." The words landed like a thunderclap. Gasps echoed around the room. Executives looked at each other, confusion and shock in their eyes. Leonard felt a cold sweat creeping up his spine. This wasn't possible. David Carter, Jacob's father, had been gone for years. And everything Leonard had told the world, that David had been unfit to lead, that he had left willingly, that he had no heirs, it was all a lie. A carefully constructed, meticulously planned lie. And now it was unraveling. "You're lying," Leonard snarled, his fingers tightening into fists. But Jacob only smiled. "Am I?" He slid a thick folder across the table. "Go ahead. Take a look." Leonard hesitated. His gut told him not to open it. But the way the executives were watching, their curious, expectant faces. He had no choice. With stiff fingers, he flipped it open, and his blood ran cold. Inside were documents, real, undeniable records, old partnership agreements, private emails, even a handwritten contract proving that Sterling Innovations had originally been co-founded by David Carter, a contract that, upon David's death, would have transferred ownership to his rightful heir, to Jacob. Leonard's vision blurred, because he had covered this up, destroyed every document, made sure the world never knew about David's son. But here was the one person he had never expected, standing before him, holding all the proof. And the worst part? Jacob wasn't rushing. He wasn't shouting, wasn't demanding anything. He was calm, in control. Everything Leonard used to be. And for the first time in his life, Leonard Sterling felt powerless. "I spent years working in silence," Jacob said, his voice even. "Watching, learning, waiting for the right moment." He met Leonard's gaze. "Did you ever wonder why no one recognized me?" Leonard didn't answer, because now, looking at him, he did look familiar. Not as a janitor, but as a boy. A boy who had once walked these halls alongside his father, before Leonard had torn his family apart. Jacob straightened, his expression unreadable. "It's poetic, don't you think?" Leonard swallowed hard. "What do you want?" Jacob smiled. "What's mine?" Leonard Sterling sat in stunned silence, his fingers gripping the edge of the boardroom table so tightly his knuckles turned white. This isn't happening. This can't be happening. And yet, Jacob Carter stood before him, completely in control. For the first time in his life, Leonard was not the most powerful man in the room. The executives, once so eager to please him, were now leaning forward, interested, intrigued. Because Jacob Carter wasn't just a random investor. He was the true heir to Sterling Innovations. And now, he had come to collect what was rightfully his. Leonard swallowed down his fury and forced his voice to stay calm. "You think you can just walk in here and take over?" Jacob tilted his head slightly. "No, Leonard. I don't think—" He slid a document across the table. "I know." Leonard snatched up the paper, his eyes scanning the words, and with every line he read, his stomach sank further. This wasn't just a takeover bid. This was a legally binding challenge to his position as CEO, based on his own company's bylaws. Bylaws that David Carter had put in place decades ago, before Leonard had forced him out. If an heir to a founding partner emerged with majority investor backing, they could demand a leadership vote. And Jacob Carter? He had already secured enough shares to trigger the vote. It was over. Unless... Leonard had one last play. Leonard threw the document onto the table. "This is nonsense," he snapped. "You think the board will just hand over the company to some janitor?" Jacob's eyes gleamed. "A janitor who owns 51% of your company, Leonard." A murmur rippled through the room. Some of the board members shifted uncomfortably. Others looked intrigued, because they had seen what Leonard had become over the years. Cold, paranoid, reckless. And Jacob? Jacob Carter represented something new, something promising. But Leonard wasn't done fighting. "You have no experience running a corporation," he spat. "No track record. The board won't just roll over for you." Jacob smirked. "I think they might," he said. "Especially since I've already been speaking with our top investors, and they seem open to the idea of new leadership." Leonard's heart pounded, because this was happening too fast. He needed to stall, to buy himself time, and then suddenly, he saw his way out. Leonard let out a sharp breath and leaned back. "You're right," he said. "You have the shares. You have the legal standing. But you don't have something just as important." Jacob raised an eyebrow. "And what's that?" Leonard smiled, slow and dangerous. "The experience to actually run this company." The room went quiet. Then, slowly, Leonard continued. "Business isn't about revenge, Jacob. It's about skill, about knowing when to strike and when to hold back." He spread his hands. "You might have the board's attention, but if you fail, if the company crashes under your leadership, you won't just lose control." He leaned forward. "You'll destroy your father's legacy." Jacob's jaw tightened. Leonard knew he had hit a nerve. Now, he just had to push harder. "Tell you what," Leonard said, his voice smooth. "Let's make a deal." Jacob's eyes narrowed. "I'm listening." Leonard smiled. "We'll run the company together for the next 6 months." A murmur of surprise rippled through the boardroom. "You'll shadow me," Leonard continued. "And if at the end of 6 months the investors still want you," he spread his hands, "I'll step down. But if you fail," his smile turned sharp, "you walk away. Forever." The board members exchanged looks. Some nodded. It was a calculated risk. And Leonard Sterling was a master at playing the long game. If he could just get Jacob into his world, his system, he could manipulate him, twist things in his favor. And when Jacob Carter failed, Leonard would bury him, just like he had buried his father. Jacob stared at him, expression unreadable. Then he smirked. 6 months? He repeated. Leonard nodded. Jacob's smirk grew. Deal. And just like that, the battle had truly begun. Leonard Sterling had always been a strategist. Every deal he had made, every competitor he had crushed, had been part of a long, calculated game. And now, he had 6 months to do the same to Jacob Carter. The moment Jacob agreed to the deal, Leonard knew what he had to do. He wasn't just going to win. He was going to destroy him. Because to Leonard, this wasn't business anymore. It was personal. The next morning, Jacob Carter walked into his new office. It was directly across from Leonard's. That had been part of the deal. If Jacob was going to learn how to run Sterling Innovations, Leonard wanted him close. Jacob wasn't stupid. He knew exactly what Leonard was doing. He could see it in the way employees still looked to Leonard for approval, the way meetings were still carefully controlled to favor Leonard's authority, the way the board hesitated every time Jacob proposed something new. Leonard was making sure that Jacob felt like an outsider, but Jacob didn't react. He never lost his cool. And that irritated Leonard more than anything. Leonard started slow. Small things. Deliberate. Targeted. He made sure Jacob was overloaded with pointless work. Reports that didn't matter. Meetings that drained his time. Last-minute projects designed to keep him too busy to gain real influence. And every time Jacob pushed back, Leonard would smile. Running a company isn't easy, is it? He'd say. Jacob never snapped, never showed frustration. Instead, he adapted. He started delegating, finding ways around the traps. Leonard watched, waiting for him to crack. But Jacob Carter? Jacob Carter wasn't playing Leonard's game. He was playing his own. 3 months in, something shifted. At first, Leonard couldn't put his finger on it. Things felt normal. He was still the dominant force in every meeting, still the man people feared and respected. But then, the little details began to change. Jacob had stopped fighting against Leonard's schedule traps. Instead, he was building relationships. Executives who had once been loyal to Leonard were suddenly meeting with Jacob behind closed doors. Lower-level employees, who had always feared Leonard, now spoke freely in Jacob's presence. Even clients, some of Sterling Innovations' biggest accounts, were suddenly listening when Jacob spoke. Leonard felt it happening. The slow, quiet shift of power. And he didn't like it. Not one bit. One afternoon during a major investor briefing, Leonard finally saw the full extent of the shift. It was a routine meeting, meant to reassure stakeholders about the company's future. Leonard had planned to take control, as always. But this time, Jacob spoke first. And people listened. He laid out his vision, not Leonard's. He talked about modernizing the company, expanding into new markets. He painted a picture of Sterling Innovations evolving. And when he finished, something unthinkable happened. The investors applauded. Leonard's stomach twisted. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was his company, his moment. And yet, Jacob Carter had just stolen the room. Leonard clenched his jaw. Fine. If Jacob wanted to play this game, Leonard would remind him who he was dealing with. Leonard Sterling had always prided himself on being 3 steps ahead of everyone else. But for the first time in his life, he felt cornered. Jacob Carter wasn't just playing the game. He was winning. The investors listened to him. The employees respected him. The board trusted him. And worst of all, Jacob wasn't making the mistakes Leonard had counted on. For months, Leonard had been waiting for him to slip up, waiting for him to stumble under the pressure. But Jacob never did. And now, Leonard was running out of options. That night, Leonard sat alone in his office, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He needed a way out. He couldn't let Jacob win. Because if Jacob won, it wouldn't just mean losing the company. It would mean proving that Leonard had never been the real power behind it. That, all along, it had been David Carter's legacy that built this empire. And that was something Leonard could never accept. His mind raced through possibilities. There had to be a way to take Jacob down. Something. Anything. Then, an idea formed. It was risky, reckless. But if it worked, Jacob Carter would never recover. 2 days later, Leonard called a board-wide emergency meeting. Jacob arrived calm as ever. He took his seat, folding his hands in front of him. Leonard didn't waste time. He stood up, placed a thick file on the table, and slid it toward Jacob. Jacob raised an eyebrow. "What's this?" Leonard smirked. "Oh, just a little audit." Jacob opened the file, and for the first time since this battle began, his expression changed, just slightly. But Leonard saw it, and he knew. He had him. Leonard turned to the board. "As you all know," he began, "Jacob has been handling many of our company's financial dealings over the last few months." A few executives nodded. "He's done an excellent job," one of them said. Leonard smiled. Fake sympathy. "Has he?" he mused. "Because according to these reports, there have been some, let's call them, questionable transactions." The room stilled. Jacob remained silent. Leonard pressed forward. "I won't make accusations without proof," he continued. "But these numbers suggest that someone in this room has been funneling company funds into private accounts." A murmur of shock and concern. Jacob's jaw tightened. Leonard saw it, and he relished it. Because this was how you destroyed someone. Not with brute force, not with anger, with doubt. Even if Jacob was innocent, even if this was all a fabricated lie, the seed had been planted. And in business, doubt was all you needed to kill a man's reputation. Leonard sat back in his chair, victorious. "Of course," he added smoothly. "I'm sure Jacob can explain all of this." He gestured toward the file. "After all, he's always been so confident." For the first time, Jacob finally looked up, and Leonard saw something in his eyes that unsettled him. Not fear, not panic, something else. Something Leonard didn't expect. Amusement. Jacob smiled. Then, he pulled his own file from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Leonard frowned. "What is this?" Jacob leaned forward. "Oh, just a little audit." The color drained from Leonard's face. Jacob gestured toward the file. "Go ahead. Take a look." Leonard's fingers tightened around the papers as he flipped them open, and his stomach plummeted. Because what he saw wasn't about Jacob. It was about him. It was his own financial transactions, his own hidden accounts, his own manipulations. Leonard felt the walls closing in. This wasn't possible. Jacob's voice was smooth. "You see, Leonard," he said, "I knew you'd try something like this." Leonard's throat dried. You set me up?" he rasped. Jacob chuckled. "No, Leonard." He leaned in. "You set yourself up. I just let you walk into it." Leonard's pulse thundered in his ears, because he could see it now. The board members weren't looking at Jacob anymore. They were looking at him. And for the first time ever, they saw through him. Leonard stood abruptly. I need time to review this." Jacob shrugged. "Take all the time you want." But they both knew the truth. Leonard Sterling was finished. 2 weeks later, Leonard Sterling resigned. The official statement said it was for personal reasons. But the world knew the truth. His empire was gone. His power was stripped. And Jacob Carter sat in the CEO's chair. The same chair that had once belonged to his father. The headlines ran wild. "Justice served. The heir returns to Sterling Innovations. Ex-CEO Leonard Sterling faces financial investigation. From janitor to powerhouse. Jacob Carter's unbelievable story." And Leonard? Leonard disappeared from the public eye. 6 months later, On a rainy afternoon, a lone figure stood outside Sterling Innovations headquarters. Leonard Sterling. For the first time, he was looking up at the building, not down from it. And in that moment, he understood. Power. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about control. It was about legacy. And his had just been erased. Final question. What would you have done? If you were Jacob Carter, would you have let Leonard walk away? Or would you have made sure he lost everything? Let me know in the comments. Was justice served? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Because in life, you never know who you're really talking to. The end.